Richard Saren's Strange Planet, following the truth wherever it leads, exposing evil and corruption and the secret machinations of powerful elites, revealing the high strangeness beneath the surface of our supposed reality. Coming to you from the Great White North and his studio beneath the stairs, here's Richard.
AM 740.
And welcome to the Audio Imaginarium. Come on in, weary traveler, hang your cloak on a peg, grab a stool, and come gather around the fire. There are stories to be told, and you are among friends. Carlos Cagina is our technical producer tonight, and Ryan White is the live stream producer. Check out my YouTube and Rumble channels at Strange Planet. Jesse James was an American outlaw, bank and train robber, some say a guerrilla, and leader of the James Younger gang. Raised in the little Dixie area of western Missouri, and James and his family maintained strong Southern sympathies. He and his brother Frank James joined pro-Confederate bushwhackers, as they were called, operating in Missouri and Kansas during the American Civil War, and were followers of William Quantrill and Bloody Bill Anderson. According to legend, we're going to separate some fact from fiction a little bit later. They were accused of committing atrocities against Union soldiers and civilian abolitionists, including a massacre that supposedly took place in 1864, the Centralia Massacre. After the war, as members of various gangs of outlaws, Jesse and Frank robbed banks, stagecoaches, trains across the Midwest, gaining national fame and often popular sympathy. And the James brothers were most active as members of their own gang from about 1866 until 1876, when, as a result of their attempted robbery of a bank in Northfield, Minnesota, several members of the gang were captured or killed. They continued in crime for several years afterwards, recruiting new members, but came under increasing pressure from law enforcement seeking to bring them to justice. And then, according to the official narrative, on April 3rd, 1882, Jesse James was shot and killed by Bob Ford, a new recruit to the gang who hoped to collect a reward on James' head and a promised amnesty for his previous crimes. Already a celebrity in life, James became a legendary figure of the Wild West after his death. So, how much of the legend surrounding Jesse James is true? The story of James' assassination at the hands of Bob Ford has been clouded with mystery ever since its inception. And tonight, James' great-great-grandchildren, Daniel and Teresa Duke, present the results of more than 20 years of exhaustive research into state and federal records, photographs, newspaper reports, diaries, a 1995 DNA test in search of the truth behind Jesse James' demise. They'll explain how the accepted version of the history of Jesse James is wrong. The authors confirm their family's oral tradition that James faked his own death in 1882 and lived out his remaining days in Texas, and they methodically unravel the legend surrounding his death with evidence vetted by qualified experts and civic authorities. They share the journal of their great-great-grandfather, kept from 1871 to 1876 and verified to be written in James' own handwriting. They reveal forensically confirmed photographs of James before and after his supposed killing, including one of James attending his own funeral. And we'll discuss how this train and bank robbing ancestor, again, faked his death in 1882, lived out his remaining years as a wealthy farmer in Texas. And we may have time to discuss his previously unknown connections to other historical figures, secret societies, lost treasures, and hidden agendas. Teresa and Daniel Duke are writers, researchers, and again, the great-great-grandchildren of the outlaw Jesse James, and the co-authors of The Mysterious Life and Fake Death of Jesse James. Daniel Duke is the author of Jesse James and the Lost Templar Treasure, and the brand new book, secret history of the Wild, Wild West. Teresa and Daniel Duke, welcome. How are you?
Thanks you for having us on the show.
My pleasure. You're both in different parts of Texas tonight, I understand.
Yes, sir.
So let me begin. I gave a bit of a brief summary of Jesse James, but we need to separate fact from fiction. But let's start, with his early years and then the post Civil War years. Who wants to start with that one?
I can. I'm more than happy to do that.
Okay, Daniel.
Well, Jesse, the traditional history on how he started out, we've never differed on. It's he was a young boy when the Civil War, actually fighting before the Civil War had started in Missouri and in western Missouri and eastern Kansas along the border, almost 10 years before the official beginning of the Civil War. And it was mostly fighting between slavery and anti-slavery states. So there were people involved in the politics of both on both sides, and they started raiding back and forth of the infamous John Brown, who would kill people and free their slaves. But there was just a lot of fighting for about a decade before that had started. Around just after the start of the Civil War, Frank James, who was the older brother of the two, he took off. He joined the Confederate Army. He was fighting guerrillas from Kansas. They called them Redlegs, had ridden onto the James farm, and Jesse, who was too young to fight, with the Confederate Army. He was plowing in his field on the family farm, and the Redlegs were said to have strapped him to his plow and beat him severely. They rode to the house. They beat his mother, and accounts vary on. She was pregnant at the time, but accounts vary on how severe she was beat. Some said she was just pushed around. Others said they strapped her to a tree and horsewhipped her. But they did hang the stepfather, not until he was dead, but until he had brain damage. They said they were looking for Frank and nobody would tell, so they made them pay. Well, Jesse, that was a rough area in a different time. He wanted revenge, and he tried to join the army. They wouldn't let him. He was too young. And he finally found a group who would let him join, and that was Quantrell's guerrillas. He proved to have been good at what he did. They trained him well, and they killed a lot of people. I mean, it was bad on both sides, but at the time, it wasn't so much with Jesse. It wasn't so much politics as just protecting his family and getting vengeance.
Right. So his sympathies with the South had nothing to do with the whole question about slavery or abolition. It had more to do with vengeance for the way that the Union soldiers had treated his own family.
Exactly.
Right. It was survival at that point.
Right.
They were treated so bad and harassed, and so at that point it was just survival more than about the slavery and choosing sides. They were just fighting to live.
Right. And there's a wonderful diary entry in the book that Jesse's mother wrote about sending him off on a horse. What was he, 14 or 15? Just this skinny little kid. And he came back, a couple years later, and she didn't even recognize him except for his blue eyes.
That's right.
They said she was been quoted and saying, the body was good for him. He was I guess that's the way he grew, and
he grew into manhood before he was officially a man, but he was bigger than most men at the time. Well, and another example I wanted to mention on that, the political side of it, like Cole Younger and the Younger brothers, who later joined the James gang and became part of the James Younger gang, they were Union supporters until Union-backed guerrillas from Kansas murdered their father and robbed and murdered him. And then they torched the Youngers' home later and burned their home down. And that's when Cole Younger and the Younger brothers had joined up with Quantrill's guerrillas also, just looking for revenge. Instead, it wasn't really politics with them and a lot of other people in that area. It was more survival.
During the Civil War, Jesse was shot and received an injury to his lung, not once but twice, I believe. Correct?
Yeah,
That's
he was
right.
trying to surrender, and that was the other thing. They did try to do the right thing. They were going to surrender, but he got shot, and they were trying to just kill him, but they were trying to do the right thing, and they were just kind of forced into doing the outlaw life that they led.
Right. So after the end of the Civil War, Frank and Jesse are they still with the guerrillas at that point? The Quantrill Rangers, I think, as they were known.
Yeah, they were with Quantrill's guerrillas up until the very end. And then, all the guerrillas separated and went their own ways after that. A lot of them went to Texas, which is the direction Frank and Jesse went later. Jesse settled in Texas permanently, but that was years later. Most of the guerrillas were, if they turned themselves in, they were usually executed in one way or another. And if they didn't turn themselves in, they were hunted down and executed that way as well. So
right. So they weren't granted amnesty, Frank and Jesse. So the Civil War really never ended for them in many respects.
That's true. And the way I often look at Jesse, it reminds me of, you see news stories of wars today with child soldiers. And that's basically what a lot of people were here during the Civil War. And Jesse I consider him a child soldier. And that's during those years, that's gotta change the mindset of a kid, and I guess for the rest of their life in a lot of cases.
Teresa and Daniel Duke, the great-great-grandchildren of the outlaw Jesse James, and co-authors of The Mysterious Life and Faked Death of Jesse James. Daniel is the author of Jesse James and the Lost Templar Treasure, and the brand new book, Secret History of the Wild, Wild West. So the first bank robbery credited to the James gang just after the Civil War ended, I guess around February 1866. Not only the first robbery credited to the James gang, it's considered to be the first successful peacetime daylight bank robbery. Tell me about it.
That's true. You want to take that, Teresa?
Yeah,
well,
I know that, it was just the gang, they were going in to do the robberies, but the robberies weren't for just because they were bank robbers. They had a higher reason, as me and Danny and me kind of discovered later throughout the research that, they were doing it all for a higher purpose. Throughout history, they were, people try to just say, oh, they were just bank robbers, no good bank robbers. But we discovered it was more than just, they were doing it for a higher purpose.
All right. Well, we'll definitely get into that a little bit later. So this was the Liberty Bank robbery. Now, there was some bystanders. Was it this robbery that there were some bystanders killed, or young bystanders, or was that later?
There was a young man killed. They'd ridden into, they were still fresh out of the war. They had ridden in. The young man killed was 16 years old, and some say he didn't understand what they were saying. Cole Younger kept telling him to get out of the way. He didn't get out of the way, so Cole Younger shot him. And it was just that matter of fact, cold-blooded, he just shot him. They weren't angels by any means, but just I try to be, remain open-minded about that. But the thing that got me, we went up, we've toured the Liberty Bank. Allegedly afterwards, Jesse had written a letter apologizing and signed the letter, said that they didn't want to kill anyone. It was an accident, etc. And he signed it. I asked for a copy of the letter to see, or just to let me take a photo of it, and they said it upset the owner of the museum so much that he didn't display it. And I thought that's kind of strange. You have a museum talking where you're telling the story, but the letter upsets you too much. I wanted, my whole goal at that point was just to get an allegedly known sample of Jesse's handwriting to compare it against handwriting that we'd had. We found it later through other means, but that was one of our first attempts. And I just thought that was interesting that they would say a letter would cause him so much pain he didn't want to display it. And this was years later. He'd never even met the guy.
Right.
But
they were descendants. They were the descendants of the young man that was killed during the robbery. They opened up a museum. Was it in a building across the street from the Liberty Bank? Eventually,
that's right. There's a museum, and we also toured the bank building.
So, is it possible they didn't want to display the letter because, according to their narrative, Jesse James was not, America's Robin Hood. He was a ruthless killer. They didn't want to muddy the water in terms of their narrative. That here he is showing contrition, showing regret that this young man was killed, and he actually sent them a letter to apologize.
That's true.
It all depends on the perspective, like you said. Some people believe he was a cold-blooded murderer, and others are like, they were kind of forced into this by what was done to them throughout their lives.
Sorry, go ahead, Teresa.
Oh, no, like you said, you brought up a good point. It's all on, everyone has their own perspective. Some think he was a cold-blooded killer, and others, view him as a hero.
Right. And so there's a rather lengthy list of some of the, I don't know if it's all inclusive. It looks pretty inclusive. All of the banks, the Hughes and Wasson Bank in Richmond, Missouri, May 22nd, 1867, the Nimrod Long and Company Bank, and you list how much money they took. And one was something, I think that Liberty Bank robbery, they took something like, was it 60,000? 60,000 back in 18.
That was around 60,000. And I also just kind of wanted to clear up one thing. Also, when records also kind of indicate that when that the cashier was shot and killed, it wasn't like they were directly like aiming the gun to murder him. It was, they were shooting off their guns to create a diversion. So to create chaos so they could get away. And that's when it was like a stray bullet. That's what some research says.
Okay.
There's varying accounts on what actually happened.
Right, yeah. I'm sure. Then there were the train robberies, the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad train robbery in 1873. They took $6,000. Were they also getting gold at this point? Gold coins, gold ingots?
It's said by some. There's a lot of legends claiming that they got gold bars, gold ingots. I've even had other researchers, and they didn't have anything to verify this, though. They would claim that there were Confederate sympathizers in California who would have gold mines. And when they would ship their gold back to the east, they'd it was insured. So when the James gang would rob that gold shipment, they would take it, bury it, and the guy who, the original owner got the insurance for it, so he never really lost anything. So in a way, they were doubling their money. That's just one theory, and that wasn't mine. I'd heard that from a couple of other researchers, and it's interesting to think of. I guess it's a possibility. But
when did we're all familiar with the Pinkerton men. This was after the stagecoaches started getting robbed and the trains getting robbed and banks started getting robbed. You had this. We now know, Pinkerton's as a security firm, but they were. I guess, were they a creation of the banks and the stagecoach companies to go after the robbers? Who formed the Pinkerton men?
Well, the Pinkertons were they gained their reputation they were, in a sense, Secret Service during the Civil War. Alan Pinkerton was credited with, basically protecting the president and others. They were kind of like a Secret Service before the Secret Service ever existed. And then the Rockefellers would also hire them for different things, which is also where they probably, in some opinions, that's where they entered the stage with the James boys, because moneyed interests around the country were losing money, not only because it had been robbed, but just because people didn't trust the trains to safeguard their belongings, their valuables. And it got so bad at one point, trains started routing around Missouri. They didn't want to go through Missouri because they thought they'd get robbed.
Right. And
combination,
sorry,
like Danny said, a little bit of all of them that kind of like got together and like, hey, we got to stop this.
Right.
Yeah.
And we're rolling into a break here at the bottom of the hour. When we come back, we'll talk about how the Pinkertons targeted the James home, and what happened to Zerelda James Samuel, who was Jesse's mother, and that what happened to her is actually important later in identifying both of you as his great-great-grandchildren. We'll discuss some photographic evidence as well. Teresa and Daniel Duke are with us, the great-great-grandchildren of the legendary American outlaw, train robber, bank robber, stagecoach robber Jesse James, the authors of The Mysterious Life and Fake Death of Jesse James. Back with more of our conversation right after these.
In a democracy, we elect officials so we can sleep at night. So why are you up? 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
In times of economic uncertainty and chaos, your money means nothing. You may not even be able to get it from your bank or ATM. And the money you do have in the stock market will go down and down. What you can bank on is gold and silver. Gold and silver have been a reliable and trusted form of currency for thousands of years. Gold and silver have never been worth zero, and typically gold holds its value during economic turmoil. Call the Gold Hotline now and learn how to protect your money and your assets with gold and silver. And learn how to set up a new IRA or roll over your current one into a gold-backed IRA. Protect your money from the next market crash with gold and silver. Call now for your free gold guide.
800-461-9694. 800-461-9694. 800-461-9694. That's 800-461-9694.
Do you owe the IRS $10,000 or more in back taxes? Are you being audited or investigated? Has the IRS sent you a letter demanding payment? You may not owe what they claim. Make this free call to the tax doctor now. Let them negotiate with the IRS on your behalf.
800-626-4512. 800-626-4512. That's 800-626-4512.
If you're a diabetic, we have great news. You can end the painful finger sticks with a new CGM. Plus, they may be covered by Medicare, Medicaid, or private insurance. If you test and inject daily, you may qualify. Call US Med now to learn more.
800-817-2974. 800-817-2974. 800-817-2974. That's 800-817-2974.
You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Sarrett from Zoomer Radio.
And we are back with Teresa and Daniel Duke, the great-great-grandchildren of the outlaw Jesse James, writers, researchers, and they co-wrote The Mysterious Life and Faked Death of Jesse James. Daniel Duke, the author of Jesse James and the Lost Templar Treasure, and the brand new book is Secret History of the Wild Wild West, all available at Amazon. And we were talking about the Pinkertons. They went after the James well, I guess by this time, Zerelda had remarried. This was her third marriage to a Samuels, and so it was the Samuels home. Didn't they firebomb the house?
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
there
Go ahead, Danny.
Well,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. A lot of people.
No, you're good.
The Pinkertons had been after the James boys, and there was one younger Pinkerton agent had stopped in outside. It was called the Arthur House, Arthur House actually, Arthur House, and it was like a stable, and they had a diner. You could stay for the night. And the guy went in. He wanted a meal, and while he was eating, he was bragging about. He was going to be the one to help bring the James boys down. Well, the guy he was bragging to, who owns the place, was W.J. Courtney. He was a former sheriff in Liberty County. Mr. Courtney was also close friends and relatives with the James boys. He allegedly, he served that Pinkerton detective his last meal because the next day the man was found dead on the side of the road. And a lot of people said, he relayed the message to the James boys or some of his friends, and they killed the agent. It was about a year later. That's when the Pinkertons snuck up to the James farm in the night, allegedly thinking that Jesse and Frank were at the farm, and they threw a bomb. At first it was said it was just Greek fire to light the place up so they could see. Years later, about 20 years ago, a researcher had uncovered documents showing that they knew it was a bomb. They threw the bomb through the window. Zerelda she was trying to knock the bomb into the fireplace, just real quick, getting it out of the way, and it exploded. It killed her 9-year-old son, which was Jesse and Frank's half brother, Archie Samuels. And it blew her arm off, and it maimed their stepfather's hand, Dr. Reuben Samuels.
So that Zerelda's missing arm, this is going to be key in sort of establishing that Jesse James is your great-great-grandfather, and we'll get around to that. But I want to just kind of switch gears now and talk about or move ahead to how it is that you established, or I guess your mother really, your mother was kind of leading the way in this regard, how she established, first learned that Jesse was your great-great-grandfather.
Our late mother, Betty Dorset Duke, she'd grown up her whole life hearing the stories that Jesse James was their ancestor and that he'd faked his death and didn't die as history said. And, every time there was a family get together around holidays or anything, those stories were always retold. So, she grew up believing that, but when she got into high school and she was reading history and, the history book said Jesse was killed. So she wanted to know, which was right, the family story or the traditionally accepted story. And she didn't have time. She had me and my brother and sister. And when we got into college, she finally had time to start researching it. And she got all the evidence from the family that she could get and evidence that had been passed down to her and took the photos. And she was looking at the photos and, it amazed her that they did look alike, but she knew she needed more than just her word. So she took the photos to the Texas Parks. It was a Texas Department of Public Safety. They're our version of the state police. And at their forensic lab, and their forensic experts had verified that our family photos matched Jesse, known photos of Jesse, and historically accepted photos of him and his family members. So she went then to the Austin Police Department forensic photography lab, and they also verified it. She went to a third group called, back then it was Visionics. Yeah, Visionics. They were world leaders in facial recognition technology, and they sold their program, their software to government agencies and airports around the world. Well, they also verified that our family photographs matched the historically accepted photographs of Jesse and some of his family members. So we went, she was excited. She thought, okay, that's a huge step forward. in proving that the family lore was right and traditional history was wrong, and she thought people would be excited about it. So she called the James Farmer Museum in Missouri, and that's the last thing they wanted to hear.
Sure.
That's when the walls started going up. Anytime you would try to talk to them, they just put a wall up real quick. So
and it wasn't just the faces that they compared, like the photos. They did compare the photos, but it was also there was a photo of Zerelda, an historically accepted photo of Zerelda with a dress on with a certain print, and we found a photo in our collection of his mother with the same print, and we had that examined, and they said that's the same print, same dress. So we had that as well.
Right. So this would be your great 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 grandmother, who was Jesse James' mother, Zerelda, and she had an alias, and we'll explain that in a moment as well. But getting back to the Pinkerton bombing the James farm, and it was her right arm that was taken off, was it?
That was always a point of contention. We knew, like, even with the James farm, they would always ask, which arm was it? Which arm was it? And based on different photographs and the way the clothing, like women's clothing, their buttons are on the left side, whereas men's were traditionally on the right side. And the clothing at the time, we believed it was the left arm. But there's still controversy over that. Which when you can go on the internet and find forums where people just fight like cats and dogs over which arm it was. And the point we were trying to get across to them at the time was the faces match. They have the same dress, and they're both missing the same arm.
Right. What are the odds that you would have a great great grandmother missing an arm, wearing the same style dress, who bears a striking resemblance to Jesse James' mother? Now, in one photograph, oh, wait a minute, your great 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 grandmother is missing her left arm, and Zerelda was missing her right arm. But then you discovered that the negative, as often happened, they got reversed, right? It got flipped over. You were able to identify that by as you mentioned, the buttons on a woman's dress should be on the left side.
Exactly, and it was a little known facts like that. We would keep digging. It's like, we know it's the same people. I mean, the rest of the family also matches according to forensic experts. So we kept looking, and I remember Mom was like, "Oh my God, it was reversed." So, and looking at when the buttons were all on the same side, I thought that was. There were a million little keys throughout the years, just little pieces of information like that would always propel the story forward. But it's interesting how that works out.
Right. So, I mean, you've established in this case, and you are the great great granddaughters of Zerelda James Samuel and the great great grandchildren of Jesse. But then to go from that to establish that Jesse James did not die in 1882 at the hands of Bob Ford, faked his death, took his wealth and his plunder, I guess, if you will, gold and so forth, and lived out his remaining years in Texas. I mean, remaining years, he lived to be almost 100. I mean, that's an entirely different matter, right? That you have to establish that he faked his death, and let's start to talk about that. So 1882, April 3rd, set this up for us. Who's Bob Ford and what happened, according to the official narrative?
Okay, Bob and Charlie Ford were allegedly recruited by Jesse James to be a part of his new gang because the old gang had fallen apart after a failed robbery in Northfield, Minnesota. So he was looking for a new gang. This is the official story. He recruited Bob and Charlie Ford. They grew up in the area. There was fighting within the group. There was a guy named Dick Little, and he had supposedly started talking out of fear to the governor. Well, Bob and Charlie Ford were allegedly working undercover for the governor of Missouri, Governor Crittenden, who, by the way, was a distant cousin to Jesse and Frank. I found out later, which blew my mind. But anyway, Crittenden had a reward on their heads just because they wanted, the railroads, all the political reasons and monetary reasons. They were hurting the economy of the entire state. So Bob and Charlie Ford paid, they're working undercover. They were supposed to bring Jesse in dead or alive, and they knew it wouldn't be alive. So according to the official narrative, Jesse was in his house under the name of, he was under an alias in St. Joseph, Missouri. He steps up on a stool to dust a photo, a picture. They called it a sampler. It was like home sweet home type thing, embroidered and hung up on the wall. So he's going to dust that off or straighten it, and the accounts vary on that. He steps up on the stool to take care of the sampler, and they shot him in the back of the head. And they run out of the house, went down to the police, the sheriff's office. The sheriff arrests them, and that started the whole thing. There was an inquest.
All right, I got to jump in here, Daniel. Pardon the interruption. I got to take a quick time out. We'll come back and pick it up from there. Daniel and Teresa Duke, great-great-grandchildren of the outlaw Jesse James. Stay with us.
Poking holes in the darkness. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Sarrett from Zoomer Radio. To see the light, call Richard now at 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
We've seen so many people making ridiculous money from crypto, but did you know it's easy for you to do the same? The Copy My Crypto membership site shows you the coins that the YouTuber James McMahon personally holds and allows you to copy him. You don't need to know a thing about crypto or how to invest, as you simply do what he does. Let me tell you more about James. He runs the Crypto with James YouTube channel. Since March 2020, he's told his viewers to buy 26 crypto coins. Had you put in $100 into each one, it would now be worth over $53,000. So if you'd like to join the 1,300 members who copy James, then stop what you're doing and head over to copymycrypto.com/dollar. You'll not only find proof of everything I've said, but listeners get full access for just $1. You can't find this offer anywhere else, but act fast because the offer ends soon. That's copymycrypto.com/dollar. Don't take this offer lightly. He's the real deal. Go visit the site now.
Different views make great conversation. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Sarrett on Zoomer Radio. To speak with Richard live, call 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
And we are back with Teresa and Daniel Duke, great-great-grandchildren of the outlaw Jesse James, writers, researchers, co-authors of The Mysterious Life and Faked Death of Jesse James, and Daniel Duke, the author of Jesse James and the Lost Templar Treasure, and the brand new book, Secret History of the Wild, Wild West. So we had a bit of when we left, this is a short segment, incidentally. We've got about 5.5 minutes here, but when we left, Bob Ford, who was sort of working undercover, I guess, for the governor in Missouri, because they had to get rid of the James gang. They were doing some serious damage to the economy with all of these bank robberies and train robberies. A surprisingly domesticated Jesse James gets up on a chair to dust a picture on the wall, and Bob Ford shoots him in the back of the head, runs down to the sheriff's department, and then is arrested. Okay, so let's pick it up from there, Daniel or Teresa.
Okay, well, after they were arrested, then there was, call for people wanted them killed after the word hit the streets, and people were excited. People wanted to see the body, that kind of thing. They had sent for a special train to bring Jesse's mother up to St. Joseph to identify the body. So Zerelda gets there. They walk her in. The first thing she says, she looks down at the body and says, "Gentlemen, you're mistaken. That is not my son." And she walked, she's escorted out of the house. She comes back in a few minutes later and said, "You shot my poor baby. That's my son." And she was cursing them. And according to eyewitnesses at the time, it was a huge show. I mean, real dramatic. And I thought that was interesting, how she looked at him flatly said, "That's not my son." And then a few minutes later, she's cursing them and crying and wailing. Then they had the coroner's inquest a couple of days later, where his alleged wife, Z. Mims, who, by the way, was Jesse's first cousin, she didn't know his age, what finger on which hand would have been missing. She'd allegedly had 2 kids with him, but didn't know how old he was or if he had a fingertip missing or not. And if so, on either, she didn't know which hand it would have been on. There was a lot of details she didn't know about Jesse, yet she could identify each piece of jewelry she said was missing down to fine detail. And I thought that was interesting. There was a lot of hints and clues and discrepancies that were never, it just kind of got rushed through. They had people identify the body when they put it on display. They had people, known gang members come through, or people who rode with him back in the Civil War, and they said, "Yeah, that's Jesse." Well, the thing is, the only people who really knew what Jesse looked like was his family and his immediate, his close friends who were also his gang members. So knowing that Frank James was still out there, a lot of them, either out of loyalty and or fear, probably would have been afraid to say, "Yeah, that's Jesse." There's a lot of different cases where they could have said yes or no, but the fact is there were very few people who knew Jesse. Even the Pinkertons, who'd been chasing them, and they were allegedly the best in the country, they didn't even have a good description of Jesse.
Why is that? Why is that? I mean, he was tall, right? Was he 6 foot?
Yeah, Jesse was a tall man, and we'd found a lot of references throughout from the Civil War and throughout his history, his known history, that he was a tall, slender, finely built man.
And even some of the accounts from people who were robbed were saying, like when the journalist would ask them to report what happened, they would even describe them as tall men, like 6 foot and over. They didn't say, they would say that they were like tall and finely built, but not short like history reported Jesse to be.
Well, and even Jesse's mother, Zerelda, was 6 foot tall, and Jesse was taller than her. I mean, she'd even mentioned how he was taller than her when he came back, after that long period of time where she didn't see him during the Civil War. He came back and he was a tall man. And then there were a lot of people trying to claim he was a short man. And I'm not sure who put that out there in the beginning, but it served to basically confuse a lot of people.
Right. I think, yeah. And he sort of helped sow the seeds of that confusion as well. I mean, from what I understand from reading your account, that sometimes they didn't even use the name Jesse James, amongst themselves when they were in the midst of a robbery. And we'll talk about his alias, James Lafayette Courtney, who was your great-great-grandfather. And then, of course, you discover that James Lafayette Courtney was, in fact, the Jesse James. We'll take another time out and continue our discussion with Teresa and Daniel Duke, writers, researchers, great-great-grandchildren of Jesse James, co-authors of The Mysterious Life and Fake Death of Jesse James. Daniel, the author of Jesse James and the Lost Templar Treasure, and the brand new book, Secret History of the Wild, Wild West. Stay with us.
Question everything. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett on Zoomer Radio.
If you're living with diabetes and using insulin, you know the pain of pricking your fingers over and over again. Ouch! Well, by wearing a small remote device called a continuous glucose monitor, or CGM, you can reduce the pain of pricking your fingers. If you administer insulin 3 or more times per day or use an insulin pump, call now and learn how a CGM can help you.
Painless. No more pricking my finger.
No finger pricks.
Convenience. They delivered it free and they took care of all the paperwork.
You can reduce pain right away. Plus, it's accurate, easy to use, and helps you spend more time in range. And if you have insurance, you can get a new CGM at little or no out-of-pocket cost. Call now and get free shipping of your new CGM. Plus, we'll bill your insurance for you. 800-817-2974. 800-817-2974. 800-817-2974. That's 800-817-2974.
Shaking the world and seeing what falls. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
Teresa and Daniel Duke, siblings, writers, researchers, great-great-grandchildren of Jesse James. So if it wasn't Jesse James that was shot and killed by Bob Ford, who did he kill?
We believe it was his cousin Wood Height. Jesse's cousin Wood.
Did he look like Jesse James?
Yes,
Report
yeah.
says that they had similarities in their appearance.
Yeah, they were said to have bore a strong resemblance to one another.
But the interesting thing, the reason we came to believe that it was Wood Height, Wood Height's his cousin, and he was killed, reports say, in December of 1881, but his body wasn't recovered until around a couple days before the Jesse James was reportedly assassinated. So that's when his body was recovered. So it was just weird. What are the odds that Jesse James and his first cousin were both, shot and killed
in allegedly the same manner? There was kind of a love triangle between Bob Ford's sister, Charlie. Bob and Charlie had a sister named Martha Bolton, and she was having an affair with her farmhand, a man named Jim Gibson, and she was also having an affair with Wood Height. And the way the story goes on that, Wood and Jim met at, they were all there at Martha Bolton's house. It was during the winter or early spring, late winter, early spring. They got in a fight, and Wood Height shot Jim and killed him. And there was a big blow up. Wood shot Jim Gibson, the farmhand, and Bob and Charlie, many say it was Bob, shot Wood Height, and the bullet caught him in the back of the head. And then they said they buried him in a shallow grave because the ground was too hard and it was frozen solid, so they couldn't bury him deep. But Jim Gibson, his body is never mentioned, and nobody ever asked where his body was. I mean, he just disappeared from the face, from history at that point. So then, and knowing that Wood bore a strong resemblance, we believe Jesse took that. He didn't plan it. It happened, and they used that as a way to get Jesse, basically for him to fake his death and get off the hook.
So wait a minute. You're saying that they exhumed Wood Height's body, and again, he's buried in winter or late or early spring. So maybe the ground is still frozen, his body's still preserved and presentable enough to look like he was just killed in April of. But then who does Bob Ford actually shoot, or did he shoot anyone?
We believe Bob probably shot Wood Height, but he didn't. We definitely don't believe he shot Jesse James.
No.
And another thing about,
we think it was just a great opportunity for them to, it was presented, his cousin, we believe, Wood Height, and it just was a great time for Jesse to, finally get away from all that, get out of that life.
But just so I'm understanding the timeline here, but Bob Ford, in this part of this lover's spat with he killed Wood Height in maybe early spring or winter, not on April 3rd, 1882. So did he, knowing that he had killed Wood Height and not Jesse James, did he go to the sheriff's department to claim a reward and basically lied, saying, I just killed Jesse James, knowing very well he had killed Wood Height, the cousin?
I believe that's what he did. They had used that opportunity to pass that off. He and Charlie got the reward. I think they thought they would be famous. That blew up again. That didn't go the way they wanted it to. They were painted in history as dirty little cowards, and it didn't go well for Bob and Charlie. But what a lot of people don't realize is, and it's a known fact, Jesse had tried to fake his death in 1879, a couple of years earlier. And he, with another gang member, they claimed that George Shepard shot him in the back of the head. And George Shepard rode into town, wanting the reward. He said, "I killed Jesse. I'm here for the reward." Well, the sheriff sent out a posse looking for the body, and they never could find a body. So that fell apart, and nobody believed that Jesse had actually died. And then there were a lot of other rumors that Jesse had died. You'd see them in the papers, just researching the old articles. It got so bad that a journalist from Galveston, Texas, had said, when after the alleged killing of Jesse in 1882, the journalist said he died so many times nobody believed it anymore. So there was a lot of confusion sown for several years up to that point. And it was really, and one other thing I'd like to say, we went to St. Joseph, Missouri, the house where he was allegedly shot. And if they said he stood on a stool to straighten a sampler. Well, the ceiling was so low, he would have had to have been an extremely short man, like under 5 foot tall, to be able, to have to stand on a stool to straighten a sampler in that room, which was, I just wanted to point that out. He was, even a short man would have been able to have done that without standing on a stool. But I think they said that to try to explain away the reason he was shot at the angle he was in the back of the head.
Ah, right. So your great-great-grandfather had started using an alias something like 16 years before he was supposedly killed in 1882. Was it just the one alias, James Lafayette Courtney? Or
alias? Oh, go ahead.
Or did he use other aliases?
He was known to have used other aliases, but that was the alias he lived under in Texas. There's probably aliases he used that we may never know. And then there's a lot of variations of aliases, but a lot of the men, even men who didn't go into outlawry, former Quantrill's guerrillas, for example, they changed their names because they didn't want to get hunted down and killed like a lot of their former comrades had.
So maybe Teresa, I'll get you to handle this one. There was a real James Lafayette Courtney, right? And your great-great-granddad took his name, but who was the real James Courtney? Do we know?
Well, we believe that they were related to the real James L. Courtney. And records indicate that he was a Union soldier, a bugler. What was it, Danny? A bugler in the Union Army. Right. But we believe that's how he knew of the James L. Courtney, and that's how they had a lot of connections with the Courtneys. They had neighbors who were Courtneys. They were related to the Courtneys, and we just believe that's opportunity presented itself, and he took on that alias.
And there were a lot of that side of the family would change their name from Courtney to Hahn and Andrus, and they had changed their name several times, and it was hard following the name changes. If we hadn't had family records and letters from all of them, or from most of them, it would have been near impossible to figure it all out.
So before your mother Betty sort of connected the dots and realized that your great-great-granddad was Jesse James, it was presumed that your great-great-grandfather's name was James Lafayette Courtney, and your great-great-great-grandmother was not Zerelda James Samuel, but Diana Andrus Courtney. Is that right?
That's right.
Yep,
that's right.
Correct.
So Jesse's mother also changed her name? Did she move to Texas with him, or how did she come to have that alias?
Zerelda, actually, that wasn't Zerelda's alias. That was James Lafayette Courtney's mother was, Diana Andress Courtney. And they had moved to Tennessee, whereas Jesse's mother stayed in Missouri. She would travel. In fact, when she died, she was on her way back from Texas to Missouri and died on a train. She was an elderly lady at the time, but she traveled to Texas quite a bit. We even have a photo of her at Jesse's farm in Blevins, Texas, when Frank married Annie Ralston.
And Frank was Jesse's brother.
We just have about a minute here. I just want to touch on this, and we'll continue this conversation into hour 2 with Teresa and Daniel Duke, and take calls at the bar, or questions from the live chat at the bottom of the next hour. There's a photograph in the book of Jesse James at his own funeral. Tell me about that.
Well, so rumors always persisted. People said that Jesse James attended his own funeral, but we can never find proof of that until one night we were just, doing our research, and we came across this picture that said Jesse James's funeral, and there was a picture of Grandpa Courtney with his mom and Frank in the picture. So we believe we have a picture that proves he didn't attend his own funeral. So we were always trying to put that rumor to rest to see if he really did attend it or if he didn't. And we believe we found the picture that said that he did actually attend his own funeral.
Wow, that's pretty brazen. All right, we'll come back. We'll head into hour 2 here with Teresa and Daniel Duke, great-great-grandchildren of Jesse James, writers, researchers, and back with more of our conversation right after these.
Question everything. This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett on Zoomer Radio.
This is Zoomer Radio Toronto. CFZM FM and CFZM AM. Owned and operated by MZ Media Incorporated.
With Richard Serrett on Zoomer Radio.
Thank you for inviting me into your home, your long-haul truck, RV, camper, taxi, your parents' well-appointed basement with the simulated wood paneling, electric fireplace, and the painting of dogs playing poker, your loft, that greasy spoon just off the interstate, and your cabin in the woods. Carlos Cagina is our technical producer, and Ryan White is our live stream producer. Check out my YouTube and Rumble channels at Strange Planet. And we are discussing the mysterious life and faked death of the American outlaw Jesse James with 2 of his descendants, his great-great-grandchildren, Daniel and Teresa Duke. They're 20 years plus of research, in addition to research by their late mother, Betty Dorset Duke, leads to the rather inescapable conclusion that Jesse James was not killed by Bob Ford in April of 1882, that he faked his death, took on an alias, James Lafayette Courtney, and lived out a very long life in Texas as a farmer. Again, Teresa and Daniel Duke, the co-authors of The Mysterious Life and Faked Death of Jesse James. Daniel Duke, the author of Jesse James and the Lost Templar Treasure, and the brand new book, Secret History of the Wild, Wild West. Just getting back to sort of the mythos of Jesse James. How did he or why did he become known as America's Robin Hood? I mean, was he literally like, taking from the rich and helping poor people?
That's a good question. A good question. There were a lot of stories that Jesse had, and some of these were myths. Some of those were also based on stories by a journalist who was sympathetic to the James and Younger boys. His name was John Newman Edwards, and he would write like it was a fiery journalistic voice. It was always in support of the James boys and how they were done wrong. And like I've said before, I don't believe they weren't. I don't think they were psychopaths and horrible, bloodthirsty killers like some have painted them. But I also would readily admit they weren't angels by any means. But there were stories that, like, one lady had owed taxes, and they were in that area. They heard the lady owed taxes. The tax collector was coming to either get the money or take her farm. And Jesse and his gang members gave her some money, told her to pay the taxpayer, and then they left and went and waited on the road. So after she paid the taxpayer, she got a receipt showing she paid the taxes. When he was riding back towards town, they robbed him and got their money back. And there was a lot of stories like that, but they're hard to prove. But stories like that got around real quick. People thought of Jesse as a Robin Hood. And there was one quote by Laura James I always loved. It was Jesse James represented every man who'd ever felt the boot of the man on their neck. And I thought that sentiment alone, along with the rumors, just seemed to catapult them into legendary Robin Hood status.
Right. And how much of the sort of the sympathetic version of Jesse James may have been fueled by, in the South, resentment during the Reconstruction era, the way that the North treated the South? I mean, the slavery issue aside, I mean, let's face it, there were atrocities on both sides, and the Union during Reconstruction, pretty harsh on the South. How much do you think that the Reconstruction era sort of fueled the recasting of Jesse James as a hero and as a Robin Hood?
I think it had a lot to do with it. I'm glad you mentioned that. The Reconstruction era, people lost, everything they had. There were a lot of people who, if their business had been shown in some way to have supported the Confederacy, and when you're in the Deep South and you're not supporting them, you look like a traitor. So you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. But if their business had been shown in any way to have supported the Confederacy, the North, or what they called carpetbaggers, would take their property from them. And so, people were very bitter. Their livelihood was lost. They had nothing left. And that, I'm sure stories like that did nothing but serve the James gang and their reputation.
So,
then there was a lot of things, like people, I've heard a few people also argued. I agree with the point. Slavery was horrible. I don't agree with that at all.
No.
But at the same time, the Northern, after the North won, they then went and wiped out a lot of Native American tribes. So it was kind of, like it was a bit hypocritical in ways. So people would see things like that, and I think that also helped towards, help support the James gang story.
As of 1882, when Jesse faked his death, do we have any idea what kind of a fortune he and the gang had amassed? And when you add up all of the train robberies and the bank robberies and the steamboat robberies and stagecoach robberies, how much loot did they end up with?
That's a good question. I'm trying to remember the figures. Every time I think of that, I always think it doesn't add up to all the amounts of gold he was said to have buried in single catches.
Yeah, like one, one was like the first one, Liberty, was like 60,000. There were others that were like in the amount of 3,000. So I mean, I don't know the exact amount, but I mean, I do think that they got away with, you know, quite a large sum. Just that first one, 60,000 for back in the in the 1800s was, you know, that's a lot of money back then.
That would have to be worth several $1 million in today's dollars, I would think. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it was
so.
just that one bank robbery was, yeah, it was a lot.
And did they divvy up things? I mean, was the James gang? Was it a dictatorship with Frank and Jesse ruling the roost, or was there? I don't know. Did they divvy up things democratically? How did the gang run?
The way I understood it, they always it was basically modeled after the way they did things when they were riding with Quantrill. But I think they were a little more democratic than that. They would discuss a target and basically vote on whether they thought it was right or not. And they had the right to sit out on one or not. Most of them, you know, they had the attitude, we ride together, but at the same time, there were times where they would also split up and hit multiple targets in the same areas within days of each other, and sometimes on the same day. So that's another thing that also led to confusion. I think it was a great guerrilla tactic. They probably learned during the Civil War. People would attribute it to Jesse, and yet sometimes it was Wood Height leading a group that rode into town, or Cole Younger, or Frank James.
Right,
so
the B Squad.
They didn't know exactly who they were chasing.
But for some reason, it was Jesse who seemed to stand out. I mean, with history, like I always say, you know, he had a brother, Frank, but you don't hear about Frank James much, or like the Youngers. I mean, you know, there's little bits throughout the history books on them, but it always seemed to focus on Jesse. And that, you know, I don't know why, you know, it worked out that way, but it panned out that way, but it all seems to be focused more on Jesse.
Right. And so by April of 1882, when Jesse fakes his death, Wood Height becomes Jesse James and is, you know, put into the ground. And that's supposedly the end of Jesse James. Jesse James heads to Texas as James Lafayette Courtney. Who's left in the James gang, and does all of that money revert to Jesse, or does Frank also have a big portion of that? Did they flee together? What happened?
And I didn't hear which one you were talking about. Was that
Jesse and Frank. When Jesse fakes his death in 1882, is Frank in on it? Does Frank flee with Jesse? What happened?
No, so Frank ended up going to trial after the supposed assassination of Jesse James, and ended up being acquitted of all charges. So we found that really interesting. So he didn't ever have to go into hiding, Frank James.
How is it possible that he eluded charges?
That's a good question. They had a lot.
Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead, Teresa.
He was. They took him to trial for, I want to say it was the murder of some. I don't remember who, but he was brought up in, like, you know, the robbery charges, but also murder charges, and he ended up being acquitted of everything. So he didn't have to go into hiding. And then I think he died. I want to say Frank James, he lived to be fairly old, but I think he died in like 1910 or something, Danny, or 1915?
I thought it was 1919. I can't
remember exactly, but
right.
Long story short, he didn't have to go into hiding like Jesse did.
Was he aware that Jesse had faked his death?
I'm sorry, you'll have to repeat that.
Did Frank know that Jesse had in fact faked his death?
Yes. And that's a good question. I always wondered if he knew right away or how long it took him to find out, because there were a lot of rumors rumors flying around, and I'm sure that that happens during any event like similar to that, that Frank was on his way to town and people were going to pay. And then I have a feeling he may not have known until he got in the area. He probably spoke to one of his friends, fellow gang members, or one of his family members and found out. And then when he found out, he backed off. I'm not sure how that would have worked out, but that's a good question. I've always wondered, and my best guess would be that he got word from a trusted source, and that's when he found out.
So how do we pick up the trail from St. Joseph, Missouri in April of 1882 to James Lafayette Courtney, gentleman farmer in Texas, who lived right up until the 1940s, I believe. How did you pick up that trail, and how do we find out that he was Jesse James?
Well, he had
Can I say one thing before we move on to that?
Yes.
It's regarding Frank and his wife, Ann Ralston. They did a news story with her shortly before she died, and she made the comment. She was 91 when she died, but she made the comment that the true story of Frank and Jesse would go to the grave with her. So I think that they had to be in on it as well. Frank, I think he personally did know about Jesse's, that he did fake his death and move to Texas, because she moved to Texas as well.
And Ann Ralston was who? Sorry?
After Frank died.
Who was Ann Ralston?
Frank James's wife.
Ah, okay. All right.
Yeah, and they did an article with her a couple of months before she died. She was 91, but she did state that the true story of Jesse and Frank would go to the grave with her.
Ah, okay. That's
so I personally think that, Frank was in on it the whole time.
Right. Okay. So take us from St. Joseph, Missouri to James Lafayette Courtney's farm in Texas.
Okay. Well, Jesse had been living in Texas since 1871. He came to Texas, met my third great grandfather, Thomas Hudson Barron, who was a captain with the Texas Rangers. And when I heard that, I thought, okay, this is wild. But it was known, our late mother had found proof that, and there were old wanted posters for Jesse and Frank and the Youngers, saying that they were known to have ridden with Texas Rangers around the Dallas, Texas area. So, and I thought, well, it's not actually that strange, because they'd all fought on the same side during the war, and some of them probably fought together. Some of a lot of Texas Rangers, especially back in those days, had ridden both sides of the fence, so to speak. Many of them used to be outlaws and then became lawmen, and some would just jump back and forth throughout their career.
Oh, I didn't know that. Fascinating.
So, yeah, I always thought that was pretty interesting. But in 1871, and we have his diary from 1871 up through 1876, and it wasn't a normal diary, like he didn't talk about his feelings. It was more of a day book. He'd write down the facts. But he mentioned places everywhere he'd gone. He even signed his name Jesse, J. James, and also JWJ, his initials, which were Jesse Woodson James. He'd written the name James J.L. Courtney many times on the back, almost as if he were practicing that new signature. But in addition to that, he mentioned known gang members that he'd ridden with that lived in that area at different times, and a lot of different facts that actually served. Without that day book, we wouldn't have been able to crack a lot of that. So, it was the confusion was caused by him because he needed to, but just to get away and live a peaceful life. But at the same time, his day book also unopened and unraveled a lot of that confusion.
So
But
he married, settled down, and where was his spread? Where in Texas? Where was his farm?
it was in
Blevins,
Blevins,
Texas,
Levin.
which is, yeah, it was Blevins, Texas, and it was not too far from Waco, Texas.
And it's about probably, well, back then it would have been about a day's ride southeast of Waco, Texas. Now it
Yeah.
takes about an hour.
How many acres?
180. I think it was 180 acres that he purchased from his father-in-law, Thomas Barry.
And did he buy it with gold or?
He purchased it with gold, all with gold. I think it was $800, and he paid for it all in gold coins.
Wow.
When he rode into Texas, he had saddlebags with gold coins.
And what kind of a farmer was he?
He didn't ever seem too busy based on his day book. It was always someone else doing the work, or he didn't seem busy at all. I mean, he would do things like, brand a calf, things like that. And a lot of the time he was going into town and buying things for his wife and children. But he would cut like a half an acre of tall grass or reeds and different things like that. But it wasn't a whole lot of work, especially for those times. I mean, usually a farmer was working from sun up to sundown, and he seemed to live pretty leisurely.
Right. I mean, he didn't need to work because he had. Well, what do we know? What was he worth in terms of? Well, let's just look at the gold. How much did he? Did he have like buckets of gold around the house?
Yeah,
Buried,
he
yeah, he had gold buried. And he also, there's a story about his son. His son's name was Byron Courtney, but he gave a job to Byron to count. He had gold in a trunk, and every day he would have Byron count that gold every day to make sure, I guess, that no one was dipping into it. But that was one story. He had a trunk full of gold in his house, and he would also bury gold in jars in his yard.
Wow.
And he also had he was fond of the Ford cars, and every year he would have a new car on hand. Like he had to have a new car. He was always buying new Ford vehicles back then.
What was he concerned? Did he think that one day someone's gonna, catch up with me and figure all of this out? I mean, was he nervous that he was going to be apprehended?
I believe so, and I think Danny can agree with me on this, but in his journal, people would come to his farm and they would introduce themselves, and he would always say in the journal, or so they say. Like, to me, that seemed like he was paranoid. Like, they would come introduce themselves for whatever reason that they were going out to visit on the farm, and then he would say, so-and-so came today, and then he would say their names, and then it would say, or so they say. Like, I felt like there was a hint of paranoia with anybody who would come to his farm.
Well, and also when he would, if someone rode up to his house after dark, he would always blow out all the candles or all the lanterns in the house, and he would draw his gun and lay down across the floor next to the front door. So I was assuming if they came in, they'd trip over him, and I don't think they would expect someone shooting from the floor if that's what they were planning on doing. He seems pretty paranoid.
Right.
Yeah.
How was he with a gun? How was he with a gun?
They also, he did get the attention of the government because they were always sending him letters wanting to know how he had all the assets that he had. So we do have some letters where the government was like, explain this, how you have this and how you have that. So he did have to deal with that as well.
How was he with a gun?
There was actually, we had an eyewitness account or eyewitness to that that we had met. His name was George Roming. He's passed since. George was a young boy when Jesse was an older man, and I was thrilled to just meet someone who had spoken to Jesse. George grew up in the area. He was about 9 or 10 years old, and he said Jesse would wave to him up, to come sit on the porch with him and have lemonade. And George said Jesse would talk to him, and he was always scared to death of him just because he said he was a big man with a big hat and a great big mustache, and he always had a big gun next to him. So he said one day Jesse told him to carry a stone out 40 paces across the yard and set it down. And when George got back, he said Jesse stood up, stepped off the porch, and before his foot hit the ground, he shot the rock. He just drew his pistol and shot it. And he was in his 80s at the time. So, I'd say he was a very good shot. There were also stories that before they would have, if his wife wanted to cook some chicken for the family, he would get on his horse sometimes and show off for his kids, and he would ride by at full gallop and shoot the head off of a chicken. So I'd say it was a good shot.
Sounds like it. All right, we'll take another time out. And if you're in the live chat, get your questions and comments ready, and my live stream producer, Ryan, will curate those and send those on to me, and I'll put those questions to Teresa and Daniel Duke as we continue our discussion on the outlaw Jesse James. Back with more in a moment. Don't go away.
The truth will set you free, but first, it will really tick you off. You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett from Zoomer Radio.
In times of economic uncertainty and chaos, your money means nothing. You may not even be able to get it from your bank or ATM. And the money you do have in the stock market will go down and down. What you can bank on is gold and silver. Gold and silver have been a reliable and trusted form of currency for thousands of years. Gold and silver have never been worth zero, and typically gold holds its value during economic turmoil. Call the Gold Hotline now and learn how to protect your money and your assets with gold and silver. And learn how to set up a new IRA or roll over your current one into a gold-backed IRA. Protect your money from the next market crash with gold and silver. Call now for your free gold guide.
800-461-9694. 800-461-9694. 800-461-9694. That's 800-461-9694.
Do you owe the IRS $10,000 or more in back taxes? Are you being audited or investigated? Has the IRS sent you a letter demanding payment? You may not owe what they claim. Make this free call to the tax doctor now. Let them negotiate with the IRS on your behalf.
800-626-4512. 800-626-4512. That's 800-626-4512.
If you're a diabetic, we have great news. You can end the painful finger sticks with a new CGM. Plus, they may be covered by Medicare, Medicaid, or private insurance. If you test and inject daily, you may qualify. Call US Med now to learn more.
800-817-2974. 800-817-2974. 800-817-2974. That's 800-817-2974.
Don't be afraid of the dark. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett from Zoomer Radio. To talk to Richard, call 416-360-0740 or toll free 1-866-740-4740.
And we are back with Teresa and Daniel Duke, great-great-grandchildren of the outlaw Jesse James, who faked his death in April of 1882 and lived under the alias James Lafayette Courtney as a farmer in Texas. How long did he live?
7. It was in 1943 when he died.
And I'm sorry, how old was he again?
97.
97. Wow. And how many children did he have?
Teresa?
Like 7.
7 children.
Total?
He had 7 children.
Yeah, we
And-
also know that there are other diaries out there. We don't have those in our possessions, but what I find interesting is he had such a long life. He would mention things like an airplane, and he would put it in his journal. He would call it a flying machine, just went over his house. Like, those are the things I would love to see, because, you know, just seeing this outlaw who was from the, you know, Civil War time in the Western days. And I would love to see those journals that mentioned, you know, like when he drove his first car, or, you know, seeing the plane in the sky. It's just things like that. That's what I would just love to see. I would love to find those journals and see that for myself. That there's just so much history, a span of history in there, you know, that you just can't get in a lot of stuff. And he had a lot of history.
Right. Let's go to the YouTube live chat with some questions here, and we're going to begin with Not Gordian, as in Gordian Not. Not Gordian asks, what happened to Jesse James revolvers?
That's a good question. I think most of them probably are scattered to the ends of the earth, but there were a couple we've seen. There was one we know for a fact was his, and we tried to. At the time, the man who owned it lived about 2 miles from where Jesse's farm was. He wanted more than we had at the time, but he said he would hold on to it. And right when we got the money to get it, he had passed away, and his family upped the price. They increased the price threefold, so we never got it.
Would there be any way of authenticating that pistol?
We did. We got we did it. We did as much as we could, and everything about the pistol lined up with everything we knew about Jesse. But he also carved inside the handle were the initials of other known gang members, and it just seemed too. We would have to, of course, we would want to take it to professionals so they would be able to examine it and make sure. But everything about it seemed right on the money.
Did he let anyone in on the secret in Texas? Any of it? Did he ever tell his children, or did he have a best friend, a confidant in Blevins, Texas, that he actually said, you know what, maybe over a beer or too many beers, I'm Jesse James?
We believe some of his family members knew. Like, it was passed down in our family through his daughter Ida. She knew, and that's how it was passed down through us. I mean, we've heard it our entire lives. My mom heard it when she was a kid, and
yeah. And a lot of the gang members, some of the gang members and a lot of the former Quantrill guerrillas who had ridden with him lived all around that area.
And George knew, Danny.
Yeah, I know George. Yeah, that's true. George knew.
Yeah.
Who's George?
Actually, George was the former World War II vet I'd mentioned earlier that we met. He was the one who told me the story of Jesse shooting the rock. George was sworn to secrecy by Jesse before Jesse hired him to help him move 700 bars of gold about 18 to 20 miles from Jesse's house.
Wow. All right. Robert S. Scott asks, do Daniel and Teresa have to deal with any backlash due to the family connection with Jesse James?
I've met.
Yeah.
There was.
Sorry, Danny.
Oh, go ahead. Well, there was a man I met at my first book signing, and I didn't know what to think, really. I didn't expect it. The guy came up and said, your ancestor shot my ancestor and killed him. What do you think of that? And I didn't know what to say. I just said, well, I guess he should have been a better shot. And I didn't know in hindsight, I would have said it differently, but that just little things like that. I don't really know how you would. I'm not going to apologize for something I didn't do.
Exactly. Right.
But
I've heard people criticize it, and people who find it fascinating, and I've just learned to come to the realization that everyone's gonna. We have the facts laid out in the books. We have documented, evidence pointing to him being Jesse James, and some people can see it and believe it, and then there's others who just don't want to acknowledge any of it. So,
was there any consideration to exhuming the grave? In fact, determining whether it was Woodhite or Jesse James? Was there a exhumation?
Oh yeah, in 1995, the James Farm and Museum and people associated with that hired Professor James E. Stars, who was a law professor from the University from Georgetown University, and he had no back. His hobby was forensics, but he wasn't a professional in that field, which I thought was interesting. If you're, anything dealing with history, they should have a professional doing it, someone who was qualified in that field. But they hired a law professor to do this. And no pun intended, but our late mother shot that whole exhumation full of holes. There was multiple mistakes. I mean, it was enough mistakes they made to fill several chapters. And including Stephen Caruso, who was the attorney. He was a Clay County attorney at the time. He told my mother and I in person that it was a tawdry sideshow, and he's even said that on film. He said the hair they tested he was ordered by the court. He held a sample of Jesse's hair and for the museum. Well, the court had ordered him to turn the hair over to James Stars. And he said he didn't trust the guy. So instead of turning that hair over, he pulled the hair out of the Clay County Parks Director's hair, John Hartman, out of his head and submitted that. And what made me laugh, I mean, it's sad that it got that messed up, but they tested that hair and on a documentary claimed that was Jesse's hair or met all the requirements to be Jesse's hair. And I thought that's insane. I mean, he pulled his friend's hair, and the tooth they tested, Stephen Caruso said, I can guarantee you it had similar origins, but he wouldn't say where the tooth came from.
In other words, it didn't come from the body in the grave, supposedly, belonging to Jesse James. It came from somewhere else.
Exactly.
All right. Way Anella asks, do you think the Clint Eastwood movie, The Outlaw Josie Wales, was based on Jesse James' life story? I hear similarities between the movie plot and Jesse's story.
I do think that. I think watching Josie Wales was it was very close, almost identical to the story of not only Jesse, but a lot of the other guerrillas who rode with him.
All right. We just have about a minute, 2 minutes or a minute and a half here. I want to just talk briefly, and we have to have you back on and talk about the gold and the fact that he hid gold all over the place and left maps. And you alluded to this earlier, Teresa, when you were talking about there was this higher purpose behind these bank robberies. It wasn't just, take these ill-gotten gains and for their own personal benefit. So first of all, let's talk about the maps that you have in your possession.
Okay. Well, when my mom first started her research, her aunt gave her one of Grandpa Courtney's maps. She just gave it to her to continue with the research, and she was hoping that maybe she would eventually find the treasure from the map. But yeah, I mean, we have some of his maps, and hopefully one day we'll find some treasure out of it. But if not, it's still interesting just knowing that we have some of his maps. But we do know that he buried a lot of his stuff under his house in Texas, and a lot of his kids were always trying to dig up the gold. Even when he died and they were burying him, his son, Byron Courtney, instead of attending his own father's funeral, was trying to dig up the gold, some of the gold at his house.
All right, I'm going to take a quick time out here. Teresa, Daniel, stay with us. Back with more of our conversation about the outlaw Jesse James and your questions from the YouTube live chat. Keep them coming. Stay tuned for more.
When in doubt, blame the government. You're listening to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio.
I call it the miracle molecule, carbon-60 or C60 for my good friends at C60evo.com. And I take a tablespoon every morning. It delivers more than 172 times the power of vitamin C. C60 is a known antiviral, antioxidant, antibacterial, anti-inflammatory. It's a remedy that works. C60 Evo users consistently enjoy better sleep and wake up feeling refreshed. This alone is worth the cost of the bottle. I sleep like a baby. I have no aches or pains, zero. I'm 58 and I don't have a gray hair on my head. Get your miracle in a bottle, C60 from c60evo.com/Richard-Syrett. C60evo.com/Richard-Syrett. Use the coupon code EVRS at checkout and save an additional 10%. This statement has not been evaluated by the FDA. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. If you have a medical concern, please contact your healthcare provider. You can become an official Patreon supporter of my work here at Strange Planet Productions by donating a monthly amount through patreon.com/Strange Planet. Patreon.com/Strange Planet. There are several tiers to choose from. Pick which one is right for you, but any monthly amount is greatly appreciated. As a sign of my appreciation, you can have your name mentioned on air during my weekly radio show, or you could have your name included in a crawl on my YouTube channel live stream. You could also receive episodes of my old podcast, The Rock and Roll Twilight Zone. This critically acclaimed podcast, produced in partnership with Chris Jericho, is not currently available anywhere else. If you enjoy this podcast or my weekly radio program, The Conspiracy Show, you can really get behind me and my work by donating once a month at patreon.com/Strange Planet. Patreon.com/Strange Planet.
When you look at the sky, ever wonder if someone's looking back? This is The Conspiracy Show with Richard Syrett from Zoomer Radio. To speak with Richard live, call 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
And we're back. Teresa and Daniel Duke. An amazing story. The great-great-grandchildren of the outlaw Jesse James, who faked his death in 1882 and lived out his life in Blevins, Texas, and lived to the ripe old age of 97 as a very wealthy farmer. We'll go back to the YouTube live chat question in just a moment, but I just wanted to talk some more about the maps where he buried gold. I mean, where primarily according to these maps, did he bury this gold?
Well, that was when the map was passed down. A lot of people in the family had looked for it before it made it into our late mother's hands, and we gave a shot at it. It was hard just because it was geometrical designs, had a lot of dashes, and he had some code written in there, and the code wasn't too hard to finally figure out. It was just numbers substituted for letters and vice versa. But he would base it on the alphabet backwards or the alphabet forwards and different things like that. But the hard part was there were no geographic markers. It was just a geometrical designs drawn down with numbers and amounts of gold and silver and even greenbacks. He called them greenbacks that he had buried. So there was no starting point like, 40 paces north of the old oak tree. It was just a design, and you had to know a lot of backstory. There was a lot of questions. So I put that on the back burner, and over time, like George Roaming, the elderly gentleman who knew Jesse when Jesse was old and George was young, he had told us about another site, the one that he had helped Jesse move 700 bars of gold close to 20 miles away from Jesse's house. So that gave us another spot, and I thought, okay, I need at least one more location if I could, in that sense, to try to figure out where he had it. If there was any rhyme or reason to the areas where he would bury them. And that, a few years later, that got answered when a former Attorney General for the state of Texas, Wagner Carr, had sent his driver out. He was talking to our late mother a lot on the phone about Jesse, and he was also interested in the gold. Well, he sent his driver out to show my mother and I where several large caches were buried. And after I plotted those on the map, I noticed it all fell in line with a template. And that template, over time, it just working on it for years, it finally all fell into place. And it's a grid system that covers not only Texas, but most of the Americas. Not every spot on the grid has a treasure on it, but in an area where a treasure is, it's right on the grid. Any treasure that they had buried, or their organization, which ties into Freemasons and others, any treasure they had buried the grid was right on the money. And not only with that, but also areas of historical interest, kind of like a Scott Wolter's Hooked X, the rune stone.
Yes.
It falls on that grid.
Fortis King asks from the YouTube live chat, about this gold, how much, and is there still any around today? So according to these maps, because he sort of itemized the amount of gold and silver, how much buried treasure is out there?
I think there's still a lot out there. There were large caches that were very large, kind of like Victoria Peak in New Mexico, where there was at the time in the 1940s, it was valued at around $3 billion, which would be...
Excuse me, Daniel, did you say $3 billion?
That's right. $3 billion. And LBJ even had his hands in that too, later on. But that was a lot of money. $3 billion. I don't know how much that would be worth today, but that's enough to set a person up and generations of a family for a long time. But that was one, and that one was recovered. There were a few other very large ones like that around the Americas, but I think the smaller ones, even a jar full of gold, like an old mason jar, would be a small fortune, and that'd be enough to set most people up for the rest of their life.
Those gold caches that were discovered, and you say LBJ had a hand in one, were they verified as belonging to Jesse James?
No, that one wasn't. That predated Jesse. It even predated the founding of America. That one, I think, that people have. There were rumors that the chief of the Apaches, had buried it there after killing, or robbing wagon trains. And I thought, there's no way he buried $3 billion worth of gold deep in a cavern, and it was smelted gold bars. And what pioneer would have been traveling with smelted gold bars? If they had that, they would have had enough money to sell around the Horn, and just to sell around instead of cross it in a wagon.
All right, I've got to take a time out, Daniel. I'll come back and we'll discuss whether or not that might have been Templar gold and what this higher purpose was. Why was Jesse James burying this gold? What did he intend it be used for? Back with more of my conversation with Teresa and Daniel Duke. Stay with us.
Curiosity, or did the devil make you do it? Whatever the reason, welcome back to The Conspiracy Show with Richard Serrett from Zoomer Radio. To talk to Richard, call 416-360-0740 or toll free at 1-866-740-4740.
If you're living with diabetes and using insulin, you know the pain of pricking your fingers over and over again. Ouch! Well, by wearing a small remote device called a continuous glucose monitor, or CGM, you can reduce the pain of pricking your fingers. If you administer insulin 3 or more times per day, or use an insulin pump, call now and learn how a CGM can help you.
Painless. No more pricking my finger.
No finger pricks.
Convenience. They delivered it free and they took care of all the paperwork.
You can reduce pain right away. Plus, it's accurate, easy to use, and helps you spend more time in range. And if you have insurance, you can get a new CGM at little or no out-of-pocket cost. Call now and get free shipping of your new CGM. Plus, we'll bill your insurance for you. 800-817-2974. 800-817-2974. 800-817-2974. That's 800-817-2974.
The truth is not out there. It's right here. The Conspiracy Show with Richard Sarrett from Zoomer Radio.
All right, a few minutes remain with Teresa and Daniel Duke, brother and sister research writer team, residing in the great state of Texas and laying out an incredibly compelling case that their great-great-grandfather, who went by the name of James Lafayette Courtney, was in fact the outlaw Jesse James. And let me go back to the YouTube live chat here with a question from Rob asking, who owns Jesse's farm now?
That would be Clay County, Missouri. It's a county up in well, they're about 30 minutes north of Kansas City, Missouri.
I think he's referring to the farm in Texas. My apology. I should have clarified.
Oh, I'm sorry. The farm in Texas would be owned. It was owned. I don't know if I should say the man's name, but it's when Jesse died. Several of his children got in a big legal fight over who got the farm. They were fighting. They got lawyers. The lawyers ended up getting it, and they sold it to a family who owns it to this day. I don't know if I should say their name.
No, the name's not important, but it's not. It's out. It's no longer in the Courtney family. Let's put it that way, or the Duke family.
That's right.
And is there a lot of squabbling over the? I mean, you have a map. Are there other descendants of Jesse James who claim that they also have a map? And has this caused any friction in the family?
The main friction we've had were some of my cousins they'll come out and they want to know more, but they only care about the gold. They don't care about the history behind it. And they usually just, if they want to know that if I ever find any, that they get their share. And they seem to think they're owed a share just because they're descended. And it's not just that. They had approached, some of them had approached our late mother and asked her if there was ever a movie made on her book, if she was going to share any money she got with them from a movie. And they had never bothered to help research or anything, but they sit back and watch, and they just want a cut of the money because they're related. They don't want to do the work to actually help. So that's the part. That's where the fighting had come in a little, not much. But Mom just told them, no, you didn't help, you didn't donate, you didn't offer to help, so you're not owed anything.
If you were to find any of that gold, would you have to turn that over to the U.S. Treasury because it was stolen?
I don't.
That's a good question. I've never.
Our idea was to give it back to the Freemasons. So
yeah,
that's what we were like. What would we do if we find the treasure? And we always said to give it back to the Freemasons because we know that they would probably, give it out. They would do good with it, like charities and. Good things with the treasure that they, Jesse and them took. But I don't know. That's what we always ask that question. What would we do if we found it?
So R.E. on the live chat asks, is there a connection between Jesse James and the Knights Templar? I mean, the title of your book, the second book, Jesse James and the Lost Templar Treasure, and Daniel, you've been on with me before and we've discussed this. and there are all of these strange sort of Masonic symbols on these maps. And is there a connection between Jesse and the Knights Templar?
There are through the Freemasons. Jesse, under his alias, was a Freemason here in Texas, and I don't know when his first contact with Freemasonry was. I suspect it was during the Civil War, just because Albert Pike was a brigadier general who was often in Arkansas and Oklahoma, and there's documented records showing that Quantrill's men would be they would share a camp with Albert Pike and his men at different times. So I don't know if that's when Jesse became acquainted with Freemasonry or not, but under his alias, he was a Mason, and I traced Masonry back. You can trace even a lot of Masons. There's rumors and people who weren't too sure about it, but I was very confident after the research in my first book, the Jesse James and the Lost Templar Treasure. I showed that Freemasonry connects directly back to the Templar through Sir Francis Bacon, his mentor John Dee, and it goes back through various alchemists, Rosicrucians, Jewish rabbis, all the way back to a rabbi known as Rashi, who was a favorite court guest of Hugh de Champagne, one of the founders of the Templar. And the thing, when I wrote the book, I thought, okay, people are really going to think I've gone off the deep end here. But what made my day, it made my entire decade, all the decades I've researched this, was the current Grand Master of the Knight Templar, Timothy Hogan, wrote a glowing endorsement for that book, and it's printed on the book, and it's saying that I have indeed cracked part of the code dealing with the treasures and the Knight Templar, the Knight Templar and the treasures from the temple in Jerusalem. And that just made my day. So,
do you think that big gold cache worth $3 billion, was that in fact Templar treasure that the Templars brought over from Europe because they were being persecuted and pursued by the Vatican because of their, they were challenging the power of kings and queens. They had so much wealth. There's some theory that they deposited some of that treasure at Oak Island off of Nova Scotia and buried it elsewhere in the Americas. I think the intention was, that gold would be used to turn America into the New Jerusalem or something to that effect. Was that $3 billion cache of gold, not Templar gold?
I believe that part of it was. I would think a large part of it probably was. Not only that catch, but also in Williamsburg, Virginia, the alleged catch in Nova Scotia, which is also on the grid pattern, the template. There's a lot of different treasures that came from, I believe, France, and ultimately originated from the Templar treasures.
So did your great-great-grandfather, Jesse James, think that he was then part of that tradition and that he also was burying gold to be used for that higher purpose that you alluded to earlier, Teresa?
I believe he knew he was part of that.
Yep, I do believe that he was a part of, I believe it was all carried down within the organization, and he was a part of it and a part of the goal for the higher purpose to be used later on down in the future. Although I'm not sure what it is their plans are for in the future, though. But I do believe it was for a higher purpose.
Going back to the YouTube live chat, You Betcha asks, what are your favorite myths, lores, etc. about Jesse James? Any stories in particular that should be taken with a grain of salt?
That's a good question. Oh God, there's a lot of favorite stories. Trying to pick one is harder than I thought it would be. Well, the Robin Hood legends I thought were interesting. They're funny. One in particular, right off the top of my head, the robbery of the Achabach Brothers Bank in Corydon, Iowa, always gave me a laugh because they had ridden into town to rob the bank. They get to town, the streets are empty. Everybody's on the other side of the town listening to Henry Clay Dean give a speech. And Mark Twain had mentioned Henry Clay Dean. He was a famous fiery orator. He was a filthy man, but he gave great speeches. So he drew the whole town to the other side of town. He's given a speech. The James boys waltz in, rob the bank, no resistance. They leave, and as they're leaving, they ride by the crowd and say, "Hey, the bank was just robbed." People in the crowd turned around and shushed them. They didn't, because they didn't want them interrupting the speech. And the gang just rode on out of town. By the time the town found out the bank was robbed, they were long gone.
How about for you, Teresa? Any that's a good one. How about for you, Teresa? A famous piece of Jesse James lore?
I think for me, it's just the fact that in the guerrilla days, Jesse was always, according to the legends, he was a daredevil. Showed no fear, and he was always the front and center and taking on the other side with no fear. And I don't know, I find that fascinating. I like to think that he was like a daredevil like that. No fear. He was bold.
R. Davis asks, are there any ties from Jesse James to Italian royalty?
That's a good question.
That is a good question.
I'm not sure.
I'm not sure why he's trying to make that connection, or why she's trying to make that connection. Have you heard that before?
I haven't.
Mm-mm.
All right, I'm not sure exactly.
Something to check into.
Well, I do know one. Well, not Italian royalty. I have heard of connections with some people, some more recent outlaws from the 30s and 40s who had ties allegedly, but they weren't so much mafia or Italian, but they were tied in with, they were connected to some Italian mafia, but not Italian royalty that I know of.
What about Jesse James and the other great outlaw, Billy the Kid? Any connection there?
Oh, yeah. Billy and Jesse had met in Las Vegas, New Mexico in 1879. And that was well documented. They had allegedly met to discuss teaming up to form a new gang. And that didn't happen. But what I found interesting was just within a couple of years of that meeting, they both were allegedly assassinated by people they had ridden with and shot in the back, or shot in certain, similar circumstances. It almost makes me wonder if that wasn't planned, because there's a lot of evidence on that Billy had also faked his death. And I don't know how. I can't guarantee, I haven't researched that in depth like we have the Jesse James story, but it makes me really curious.
All right. A final point. R. Davis, who was asking about a connection to an Italian monarchy, I'm just looking in the YouTube live chat. He says, I have documents. So R. Davis, if you want to, can they contact you through the website? Either of you? Is it author Dan Dukes?
Yeah, we'd love to see that.
Okay, so R. Davis, go to the website. I've linked up to it at strangeplanet.ca. Just click on Daniel and Teresa's name, and that'll take you to the website, and you can contact them. I'm sure they'd like to see or know more about these documents connecting their great-great-grandfather Jesse James with Italian royalty. Well, the 2 hours have flown by. We'll have to do it again. There's so much more to discuss, and the secret of the wild, wild west. Teresa and Dan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having us. It's an honor.
My pleasure. All right, that's it for me. My thanks to Carlos and Ryan. Back next week with another one. Hope you'll be along for the ride. In the meantime, don't be afraid. There's nothing concealed that won't be revealed, and nothing hidden that won't be made known. What you hear in the dark, speak in the light. What I say in a whisper, proclaim from the housetops. Move over, Aphrodite. I'm coming home. Good night.